In the autumn of 1944, Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer kept a private notebook. Not a diary in the sentimental sense, a professional record, observations about the enemy, tactical notes, assessments of terrain, and the specific ways the campaign in the West differed from the Eastern Front. He had been keeping notebooks like this since Poland in 1939. The entry for October 7, 1944, was 3 sentences long. Observed American infantry unit at rest near Aachen perimeter. Sergeant arguing openly with lieutenant over route selection. Lieutenant changed the route. These are not soldiers. Fischer had spent 5 years watching soldiers. The Wehrmacht in Poland and France. 10,000 men moving like a single instrument when orders came down. The Red Army in 1941, chaotic and willing to die in numbers that horrified him. The British in North Africa, formal and very good at the specific things they had trained to do. He had never seen anything like the Americans. Not because they were better. At this stage, Fischer would not have granted them that. They were lavishly supplied. The waste, he observed, the food and equipment abandoned, would have sustained a German company for a month. Their air power he had learned to fear consistently. But the men themselves. The way a private could walk up to a sergeant and say, loudly, without apparent concern, that the plan was wrong. In Fischer's world, this did not happen. In Fischer's world, orders came down and execution went up. The private received the order and executed. The sergeant ensured the privates executed. The officer ensured the sergeants ensured the privates executed. The system was a transmission mechanism, and each soldier's quality was measured by how cleanly he transmitted the signal from above. A private who argued was not a good soldier. He was a disciplinary problem. But here was the thing Fischer had stared at after closing the notebook. The lieutenant had changed the route. Not dressed down the sergeant. Not reported the insubordination. He had looked at the map, considered what the sergeant was saying, and changed the route. In Fischer's system, this was weakness. The officer who could be argued out of his decision had revealed that his decision was not authoritative. The next time he gave an order, the men would know it was a suggestion to be evaluated, rather than a command to be obeyed. Fischer wrote, "These are not soldiers," and he meant it precisely. He was looking at the thing that would end his war. He did not know it yet, neither did the sergeant. The sergeant's name, though Fischer would never learn it, was Ray Coleman. 26 years old, from Flint, Michigan, where he had spent 3 years before the war as an automotive mechanic at a Fischer body plant. Drafted in 1942, trained at Fort Benning, arrived in France in July 1944 as part of the replacement pipeline. He had not wanted to be a soldier. He had wanted to marry Dorothy, buy a house on the east side of Flint, and spend his working life fixing engines, which he was very good at. The war had interrupted this plan. Coleman's response was the same response he brought to everything. He assessed the situation, identified what was wrong with the current approach, and said so out loud to whoever needed to hear it. This had made him an indifferent private, a frustrated corporal, and an excellent sergeant. The army had promoted him not because he was obedient, but because the men around him had figured out that when Coleman said the plan was wrong, the plan was usually wrong. Fischer had watched 30 seconds of this and written 3 sentences in his notebook. These are not soldiers. He had watched the most important 30 seconds of the war. He would spend the next 6 months slowly understanding why. The Prussian military tradition that shaped Fischer's understanding of soldiers was not built on cruelty. It was built on a theory. The theory was this: war is too complex and too fast for every man in the chain to understand what is happening and why. Orders from above represent the decisions of commanders who have access to information that the private, the sergeant, the lieutenant does not have. The private who acts on his own understanding rather than on the order he has received is substituting his limited view for the commander's comprehensive one. This is almost always a mistake. Therefore, obey. The theory was not wrong. In 18th century warfare, linear battles, slow-moving formations, engagements decided by the precision with which units executed predetermined maneuvers, it produced exactly the results it was designed to produce. Frederick the Great's Prussia was the most militarily effective state in Europe precisely because its soldiers obeyed with a mechanical reliability that no other army could match. The theory had been so successful that it became doctrine, then culture, then identity. By the time Fisher was commissioned in 1938, the idea that a soldier obeyed was not a military rule. It was a moral principle. A soldier who questioned orders was not just inefficient, he was wrong in a deeper sense, failing to be the kind of man that military life was designed to produce. The Wehrmacht of 1939 was this culture at its absolute peak. The campaigns in Poland and France were the most tactically precise military operations since Napoleon. When plans encountered reality and diverged, German officers responded with the initiative that the doctrine officially called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. The commander gives the objective and the reason. The subordinate chooses the method. This was, on paper, the opposite of blind obedience, and it was, but only within a specific layer of the hierarchy. German officers, trained for 4 years in the arts of command, could be trusted to select the right method when circumstances changed. The private was expected to execute. The judgment resided in the officer. The execution resided in the man. This distinction, judgment above, execution below, had conquered Poland in 4 weeks and France in 6. It was also the fault line that would break the system when the man above made the wrong judgment. Fisher knew about Stalingrad. The decision to hold at all costs had come from the top. The men who could see what was happening had obeyed it to their deaths. He did not write about Stalingrad in the notebook. What he wrote about was the Americans, what they looked like to a man trained in a system where judgment resided above and execution resided below. They looked like chaos. A sergeant arguing with a lieutenant had substituted his judgment for his superiors. This was wrong by definition. Not because the sergeant might not be correct, he might well be. The route might indeed be wrong. But a system where privates argued with sergeants and sergeants argued with lieutenants was a system where the command signal was filtered through a dozen individual judgments before reaching execution. The clarity of the order was degraded at each step. Fisher watched the lieutenant change the route and saw a system failing. He did not yet see what the system was actually producing. What the system was producing was Ray Coleman. Coleman had not been trained to argue. Nobody had explained that in the United States Army, the enlisted man's judgment was a military asset rather than a threat to be suppressed. He had simply grown up in a country where you argued, where you told your boss when the machine was running wrong, where the foreman was expected to listen when his men told him something important. This was democratic culture, and it had followed Coleman into uniform the way it followed every American who had ever told his supervisor the quota was unrealistic. The German system had to train obedience into its soldiers. 16 weeks of parade drills, the mechanical conditioning of men's bodies to move on command. The American system could not have trained the arguing out of its soldiers if it had tried. So eventually, reluctantly, it stopped trying. And in stopping, it discovered something 300 years of Prussian doctrine had never found. The man on the ground, who could see what was actually happening, was often right. The American Army of 1942 was not the army that Fisher observed near Aachen in October 1944. It was something considerably worse. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it had the 17th largest army in the world, roughly the size of Portugal's. The Wehrmacht had millions. What America had was a draft notice and 16 million civilians carrying everything their civilian lives had given them: democratic habits of mind, an expectation that authority must be earned, and a reflexive skepticism toward any order that didn't come with a reason attached. These qualities were, initially, a liability. The first serious test came in February 1943, at a gap in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia called Kasserine Pass. Major General Lloyd Friedendahl commanded the American Second Corps from a headquarters 70 to 100 miles behind the front. He communicated in a personal code so idiosyncratic that his own staff spent hours attempting to decipher it. He had not visited the front. He had not spoken to the battalion commanders. He had not walked the ground. This was not a failure of the Prussian system. Friedendahl was a product of an American army that had not yet figured out what to do with democratic instincts, still trying to impose a chain of command on men who had grown up questioning chains of command, without having developed the culture that made the questioning useful rather than simply chaotic. On February 19, 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps struck. The American line collapsed. The units at the front knew the defensive positions were wrong. They had known it before the attack. But the system for that knowledge to travel upward, to reach someone with the authority to act on it, did not yet exist in a form that worked under pressure. The democratic instinct was there. What was missing was the institutional mechanism to weaponize it. The result was the worst American military performance of the European War. Friedendahl's corps fell back 50 miles in 5 days, 6,000 men captured or killed, 200 tanks destroyed. The German after-action assessment was clinical. No combined arms integration, no flexibility, no adaptation. But the German assessment missed something that Fischer, watching American soldiers 2 years later, would also miss until it was too late to matter. The Americans learned. The Wehrmacht learned too, professionally, systematically, through formal channels. But the Wehrmacht's learning was bounded by its hierarchy. The lesson had to travel from the man who experienced it to the staff officer who documented it to the general who approved the doctrine change. The American lesson traveled faster, through sergeants talking to other sergeants, through junior officers who had been in the disaster, now in new units, telling the men around them what had gone wrong, through the informal democratic mechanism of men who argued about the plan until the plan was better. Friedendahl was removed 17 days after the disaster. His replacement was Patton. Patton had 17 days before the Germans attacked again. The same men, the same equipment, the same enemy. He visited the front. He walked the ground. He talked to the sergeants. In a German corps, a general did not talk to sergeants. Patton did something that would have baffled Fischer. He went to find out what the men who were actually fighting knew that headquarters didn't. He found that they knew quite a lot. On March 23, 1943, 17 days after Patton took command, the 10th Panzer Division attacked down a valley towards what they expected to be the disorganized wreckage of an American corps. What they found was a kill zone. Tank destroyers in concealed positions on the valley walls, artillery pre-registered on every approach route, a minefield that stalled the lead tanks. When the American guns opened from 3 directions simultaneously, the Germans could not identify a single firing position. In a single engagement, the 10th Panzer lost more than 30 tanks. Rommel wrote in private papers that American commanders had absorbed the lessons of mobile warfare with remarkable speed. Patton had not invented new tactics. He had listened to the sergeants. The sergeants had been right. Ray Coleman arrived in France in July 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day. He arrived as a replacement, one of the anonymous pipeline of men that fed the American army its soldiers the way an assembly line feeds a machine its parts. He did not know his unit before he joined it. He did not know the sergeants who had survived Normandy or the lieutenants who had been promoted over the bodies of their predecessors. He was a stranger who had been assigned to stand in the gap left by a man whose name he never learned. The replacement system was, by almost every military measure, wrong. The Wehrmacht did not use it. German divisions were pulled from the line to refit and reconstitute as units. The American replacement system treated men as interchangeable parts. Individual replacements, assigned to units they had never trained with, thrown into combat alongside men who had every reason to distrust a stranger. Coleman understood this the way a mechanic understands a poorly designed engine, not through doctrine, but through the specific evidence of the thing in front of him not working the way it should. His first week in the unit, he said nothing. He watched. He learned names. He learned which routes were safe, which officers listened, which veteran sergeants have the knowledge that kept men alive. He fixed a half-track that nobody else had been able to get running. On the 8th day, a lieutenant named Harris, 22 years old, West Point, 3 months in the field, announced a route for the following morning's movement. Coleman studied the map for 30 seconds. He said, in the flat voice of a man who grew up telling his supervisor when the machine was running wrong, "That road floods. The one to the north is clear and cuts 20 minutes off the time." Harris looked at him. Coleman was a replacement. He had been in the unit for 8 days. Harris changed the route, not because he was weak, because he was 22 years old with 3 months of combat experience, and he had learned in those 3 months the thing that the Prussian tradition had never learned to teach, that the man in front of him might know something he didn't, and that ignoring that knowledge to preserve the dignity of rank was a way to get people killed. This was the lesson that Kasserine had taught, not in a classroom, in a ravine in Tunisia, in the bodies of 6,000 men whose commanders had not listened to the people who knew the ground. Fisher, watching the same dynamic near Aachen 8 months later, saw a lieutenant who could be argued out of his decision. He did not see a lieutenant who had learned that being argued out of a wrong decision was better than dying for it. The distinction was the American Army's secret. Not the industrial capacity, though that was enormous. Not the air power, though that was decisive. Not even the individual quality of the soldiers, which was genuinely mixed. The secret was institutional learning without institutional rigidity. The capacity to absorb a catastrophic lesson and distribute it through the force, not through doctrine, but through men talking to other men about what had gone wrong. You don't give an American orders. You give him a mission, explain why it's important, and let him surprise you. The German General Staff had built a system for transmitting perfect orders down a perfect chain. The American General Staff had built a system for producing men who didn't need perfect orders. Because perfect orders, Coleman would have told you, are a fantasy. The road floods. Somebody needs to say so. The hedgerow was not in any tactical manual. Allied planners had studied beaches, fortifications, tidal patterns, German defensive dispositions. They had modeled weather, trained on similar terrain in England, produced one of the most thoroughly planned military operations in history. Nobody had planned for the bocage. The bocage was the landscape of Normandy's interior. Small fields separated by earthen banks 4 feet high, topped with 15 feet of vegetation, root systems 12 feet deep. Every field was a fortified position. Every bank was a wall a tank had to climb, exposing the thin belly armor to the anti-tank teams waiting on the other side. The Allied advance slowed to a mile per day at catastrophic cost. In the German army, the solution would have traveled through channels. An engineer at the front would have documented the problem. The documentation would have traveled up the chain to a staff officer who would consult technical specialists. A solution would have been developed, tested, approved, and distributed through the formal doctrine apparatus. In the Wehrmacht's efficient system, weeks. In the American Army, it took 11 days. Not because an officer had a breakthrough, because a sergeant had a welding torch. Curtis G. Cullen Jr. was 30 years old. Before the war, he had worked various jobs in the Midwest, nothing that suggested engineering genius. A sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, which meant finding out what was in front of the main force so the main force didn't drive into it unprepared. In late June 1944, Cullen was in a brainstorming session, NCOs and junior officers arguing in the specific American fashion about the bocage problem and what to do about it. A soldier named Roberts made a suggestion. What if you put saw teeth on the front of the tank and cut through the hedge instead of climbing over it? Most of the room dismissed it. Cullen didn't. He found the raw material, captured German beach obstacles, the X-shaped steel hedgehogs Rommel had planted in the surf to destroy landing craft. He welded 4 steel prongs into a cutting device and mounted it on the front of a Sherman tank. The tank accelerated toward the hedge. The steel prongs drove into the base of the earthen bank. The tank pushed through, not over, through, carrying a curtain of brush as cover and emerging on the other side without exposing its belly armor. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched the demonstration on July 14th. Within 11 days, 500 tanks had been fitted with the device. Within 3 weeks, 3 out of 5 tanks in the First Army carried the modification. Operation Cobra, the breakout from the bocage that ended the stalemate and eventually ended the German army in the West, launched on July 25, 1944, 11 days after Bradley watched the demonstration. This could not have happened in the Wehrmacht, not because German soldiers were less inventive. Cullen was not an inventor in any conventional sense. He was a sergeant with a welding torch who had listened to an idea that sounded crazy and decided to find out if it worked. But in a system where solutions traveled through the chain of command, where a private's observation had to become a sergeant's report, had to become an officer's proposal, had to become a staff study, had to become an approved modification, the rhinoceros device might have arrived in August, in September, possibly never. Fisher, had he known about Cullen, would have filed it under the same category as the sergeant arguing about the map. Undisciplined, chaotic. A private making a suggestion that a sergeant acted on without authorization from above. What Fisher would have missed was that this was not chaos, it was speed. The American army was not better than the Wehrmacht at following orders. It was better at something the Wehrmacht had never figured out how to institutionalize, the speed at which a good idea, originating anywhere in the hierarchy, could reach implementation. Cullen's idea went from brainstorming session to combat deployment in 11 days. In those 11 days, the German army was still fighting the bocage the old way. Fisher's notebook entry for December 17, 1944, was longer than usual. German offensive through Ardennes has achieved complete surprise. American line broken in multiple sectors. Significant territorial gains. Enemy appears to be in disarray. He was right about the surprise. He was right about the territorial gains. He was wrong about the disarray. What Fisher was watching was the most ambitious German attack in the West since 1940. 28 divisions, 3 armies, a plan designed by Hitler himself over the objections of his senior commanders to drive through the thinly held American line in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, and capture Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace. The plan had a structural requirement: American paralysis. In the German model, paralysis was achievable. A force that had been outflanked, whose headquarters had lost communication with its subordinate units, whose commanders were waiting for orders from above that were not coming, that force would stop. The Wehrmacht's experience had demonstrated this repeatedly. An army built on obedience, when the chain of command was severed, stopped functioning. The German planners assumed the Americans would stop. They argued. In the first hours of the offensive, American units were cut off, surrounded, or lost in fog and chaos. Officers were dead. Headquarters were overrun. The neat command structure that German doctrine expected to paralyze was, in many sectors, simply gone. In a German unit, this was catastrophic. The private trained to execute orders had no orders. The sergeant trained to ensure the privates executed had nothing to ensure. The lieutenant trained to receive the captain's objective had no captain and no objective. In an American unit, this was a Tuesday, in a war that had been chaotic since North Africa. American sergeants who had lost their officers took command and kept moving. American privates who had lost their squads linked up with strangers and formed ad hoc formations. American officers with no communication made decisions based on what they could see and what the mission had been before the phones went out. Coleman was near Bastogne in December 1944. The 101st Airborne had been rushed to Bastogne to hold the critical road junction. They arrived by truck, in winter, without their artillery, without adequate ammunition, surrounded within days by German forces that outnumbered them significantly. The German commander sent a formal written demand for surrender, invoking superior force and the honor of both armies. Brigadier General McAuliffe read the note, said "nuts," and sent a one-word reply. The German officers under the white flag were baffled. They asked what "nuts" meant. An American colonel told them, "Go to hell." Coleman did not hear about the "nuts" reply until later. He was busy. His company had been cut off from the main Bastogne perimeter. His lieutenant was wounded. His radio was out. He had 32 men, limited ammunition, and a German armored column working around his right flank. He assessed the terrain. He put his heaviest weapons, a bazooka team and a machine gun, in a position that covered the most likely route of the armored column. He sent runners to find the nearest other American units. He pulled his perimeter in to a defensible farmhouse and spent the night waiting. In the morning, the armored column took a different route. Coleman never knew if it was because of his weapons position or because the Germans had found a better road. He filed no report. He received no commendation. He had done what the situation required because the situation required it, and nobody else was in a position to do it. This was the American system at its most basic level. Not doctrine, not training. 32 men in a farmhouse in December, with a sergeant who grew up in Flint, telling his boss when the machine was running wrong. Fisher, had he known about Coleman, would not have understood it. He would have seen a sergeant acting without orders, a unit improvising outside its assigned perimeter, a chain of command so disrupted that a staff sergeant was making decisions that should have required authorization from 3 levels above him. He would have seen disorder. He would have been watching the American system working exactly as designed. In January 1945, Fisher was captured, not dramatically. His unit had been cut off during the American counterattack in the Ardennes, separated from the main German line in a withdrawal that had become a retreat, that had become a rout. He surrendered to a sergeant from Ohio who was annoyed about it because it was cold, and the sergeant wanted to get back to the farmhouse his platoon was using as a billet. Fisher was processed through the prisoner of war system and ended up in a camp in France. He had his notebook. He continued writing. The entries in captivity were different, not in their precision. He was still an observant man, but in their subject matter. He was no longer writing about terrain and enemy dispositions. He was writing about Americans. The guards were, this was the word he kept returning to, informal. Not careless, not inattentive, informal. They questioned decisions. An older sergeant disagreed openly with a younger officer about some administrative matter, and the officer eventually conceded the point. He had watched it near Aachen in October and written, "These are not soldiers." In the prison camp in January, he wrote something different. I begin to understand what I was seeing. What he was beginning to understand was the thing the German military had never systematized, even in Auftragstaktik, the doctrine that said the commander gives the objective and the subordinate chooses the method, had always been limited by the assumption that the subordinate would execute alone, without input from the men below him, without the democratic friction of people telling him when he was wrong. The American system had no such assumption. The American system assumed that everyone in the chain had information that the person above might not have, and that the system worked best when that information traveled freely in all directions, not just downward. The German theory: the organization exists to transmit commands from the top to the bottom as efficiently as possible. The American theory: the organization exists to accomplish the mission, regardless of where the solution came from. Different theories, different armies. The German theory produced an army of extraordinary tactical precision that was entirely dependent on the quality of the decisions being made at the top. When the decisions were good, Poland, France, the early Eastern Front, the army was nearly unbeatable. When the decisions were bad, the army executed them faithfully into disaster. Fisher had been at Stalingrad. He had watched an army of extraordinary quality obey its way to catastrophe because no one in the chain between the private dying in the ruins and the Führer in Berlin had been able to make the information travel upward fast enough to change the decision. The American theory produced an army that argued. That changed plans when the sergeant knew the road flooded. That modified its tanks when the sergeant had a welding torch. That held road junctions when cut off from the chain of command. An army in which every man was, in some sense, partially in command, not chaos. A different theory. Fisher, in his notebook in January 1945, was starting to write the theory correctly. He wrote, "They do not give orders in the way we give orders. They explain what they need done and why it matters, and then they appear to trust the man they have told to do something." He paused. Then, "This should not work." Then, after another pause, "It works." He was 41 pages into understanding what Ray Coleman had been doing his whole life without thinking about it. Coleman had grown up in a union town in Michigan where you told the foreman when the line was producing defective parts, and you told him loudly, and the information traveled upward because the alternative was defective parts. Fisher had grown up in a system where information traveled downward, and the man at the bottom executed, and the defective parts were somebody else's problem up the chain. The road floods. In one system, somebody says so. In the other, they wait for orders. Coleman went home in October 1945. He took the train from New York to Detroit, then a bus to Flint. Dorothy met him at the station. They had been engaged when he was drafted. He went back to work at Fisher Body within a month. The machines were different. The plant had been running military production during the war and was converting back to civilian automobiles. Coleman spent his first weeks figuring out what had changed and telling the foreman about the problems he found. The foreman listened. Coleman received a small bonus at the end of the year for catching a quality control issue that would have cost the plant a significant recall. He did not think much about it. It was what you did. You saw a problem and you said something. He married Dorothy in December 1945. They bought a house on the east side of Flint. He had 2 children. He worked at Fisher Body for 31 years. He did not write a memoir. He did not think of himself as having done anything remarkable during the war. He had been a sergeant. He had done his job. The job had required him to argue about maps sometimes, improvise in farmhouses sometimes, fix vehicles sometimes. In Flint, Michigan, a man who assessed situations and said what needed to be said was not a military innovator. He was a working person behaving the way working people behaved. Fisher remained in the prisoner of war camp until late 1945, when he was repatriated to Germany. The physical destruction was comprehensive. The institutional structure he had served, the Wehrmacht, the chain of command from the Führer to the Oberleutnant, was gone. Not reformed, gone. The officers who had built their careers on the Prussian tradition were denazified or imprisoned or dead. Fisher went back to his hometown in Saxony, which was now in the Soviet occupation zone. He found work as a clerk. He kept his notebook. In 1947, an American intelligence officer asked Fisher to participate in an interview for the official history of the European campaign. Fisher agreed. The interview lasted 3 hours. Fisher answered accurately and in detail. Tactics, logistics, specific engagements. He had a professional's memory and the discipline to keep his personal feelings out of the professional record. At the end of the interview, the officer asked a question that was not on his prepared list. What surprised you most about fighting the Americans? Fisher was quiet for a moment. He thought about Aachen, the sergeant arguing with the lieutenant, his notebook. These are not soldiers. He thought about the prison camp, the older sergeant disagreeing with the younger officer, his notebook. This should not work. It works. He thought about Stalingrad, about the chain of command that had transmitted a fatal order from the top to the bottom with perfect precision, all the way to the men who obeyed it into the ruins. He thought about Coleman, whose name he had never learned, standing at a map near Aachen, arguing about a road that flooded. He thought about where that road would have taken the lieutenant if Coleman had not said something. He thought about where the war had gone after that. The officer waited. Fisher said, "They argued, constantly, at every level, and they won." He paused. "In our system, the man at the top decided, and the men below executed. When the man at the top was right, we were very effective. When he was wrong," he stopped. "The Americans gave their soldiers missions. They explained why the mission mattered, and then," another pause, "they let them surprise everyone." The officer wrote this down. Fisher did not add the thing he was thinking. That the sergeant arguing about the map near Aachen had not been a failure of discipline. He had been the point. The American army that fought the Second World War was not built on a theory. It was built on a consequence. The theory came later, the post-war analyses, the military sociology, the doctrine revisions that tried to systematize what had happened. Samuel Stouffer's 500,000 surveys, the official histories, the memoirs of generals. The theory was assembled from the evidence of what 16 million civilians had done when put in uniform and sent to fight a war. What they had done was argue. They had argued in the training camps, in the replacement depots, in the field, about the food, the regulations, the route, the plan, the wisdom of the officer who had just given an order that seemed wrong. They had produced, in their arguing, a constant upward pressure of information, the specific, local, ground-level knowledge of men who could see what was actually happening, that the command structure had eventually, imperfectly, partially learned to use. This was not the American system's design. It was its character. The character had come from 168 years of democratic life, the specific habits of mind that a society produces when it tells its citizens that their voice matters, that authority must be earned, that the man on the ground is sometimes more right than the man at the top. These habits were liabilities in 1942. They were catastrophic at Kasserine, where the democratic instinct to argue had not yet been integrated with the military need to act. They produced, in the first year of the American Ground War, some of the most embarrassing failures in the history of the United States military. They also produced something that no other army in the war achieved, an organization that learned faster than it could be defeated. The Wehrmacht was tactically superior to the American army at almost every point in the war. The German infantry soldier, man for man, was more effective than his American counterpart. The German officer corps was better trained, more experienced, and operating within a doctrine, Auftragstaktik, that was, in theory, the most sophisticated approach to decentralized command that military history had produced. And yet the Wehrmacht lost to an army of arguing truck drivers and mechanics and clerks and students who had brought their democratic habits into uniform and refused to leave them at the door. Not because the Americans were braver, not because they were better trained as individual soldiers, because the system they had built, accidentally, through the collision of democratic character and military necessity, was better at the thing that mattered most in a long war. It was better at surviving errors. The Wehrmacht needed its commanders to be right. When they were right, Poland, France, the early Eastern Front, the system functioned with extraordinary precision. When they were wrong, Stalingrad, the Ardennes, the system had no mechanism to correct the error. The chain of command that transmitted perfect orders downward could not transmit failure upward fast enough to matter. The American system needed its commanders to be approximately right. When they were wrong, and they were wrong often, the sergeant changed the route, the private welded the hedgehog prongs onto the tank, the sergeant improvised without authorization and survived the night. The errors were absorbed at the level they occurred. The system kept moving. This is what Fischer had been watching near Aachen in October 1944, a system that had made failure recoverable, that had distributed the capacity for correction through every level of the hierarchy, down to the private who was allowed, was expected to tell his sergeant when the plan was wrong. You don't give an American orders. You give him a mission, explain why it's important, and let him surprise you. The surprise, more often than anyone had planned, was that he found a better way to accomplish it than the one the plan had specified. The surprise, sometimes, was that he found a way to accomplish it at all when the plan had failed completely and the chain of command was gone and there was nobody left to give orders. The surprise was Ray Coleman in a farmhouse in December with 32 men and no radio and a German armored column on his right flank, making a decision, because somebody had to, because that was what the system had produced, men who understood that somebody had to. Fischer's notebook survived the war, the captivity, the repatriation, the Soviet occupation zone, and the division of Germany. He kept it in a desk drawer in Saxony. He did not publish it. He had been a professional soldier, not a writer, and the notebook was a professional document. Observations, assessments, the specific record of a man who had spent his career looking at things carefully and writing down what he saw. He died in 1971. His son found the notebook among his effects and had it translated. He gave a copy to a German military historian working on a study of German perceptions of Allied forces in the Second World War. The entry for October 7th, 1944, appeared in the historian's footnotes as an example of a common German misreading of American military culture. The historian noted that Fischer's assessment had been typical of German officers in the field, that the specific quality he identified, the willingness of American enlisted men to argue with their superiors, had been consistently interpreted as evidence of poor discipline rather than as evidence of a different and, as it turned out, more durable organizational philosophy. Ray Coleman never appeared in any document related to the war. His service record exists in the National Archives. He received a Bronze Star in March 1945 for actions the citation described in the careful language of official commendations, meritorious service in connection with military operations. The citation did not describe the farmhouse in December, which had not been documented. It described something else, a specific engagement in which Coleman's assessment of terrain had allowed his platoon to avoid a prepared German position that would have cost the company significant casualties. The lieutenant who wrote the citation had learned, by March 1945, to listen to what Coleman said about terrain. Coleman worked at Fischer Body until 1976. He retired at 60. He died in 1988 at 70 years old of a heart attack in the house on the east side of Flint that he had been thinking about since 1942. Their children have his service records and a photograph of him in uniform taken sometime in 1944. He is not smiling. He looks like a man who is waiting to go back to work. This is the story that the notebooks and the service records and the official histories and the footnotes of German military historians tell when you put them together. An Oberleutnant who spent 6 years learning why he lost. A sergeant who never thought about it at all. The system that the sergeant embodied, the arguing, the route changes, the welding torches and the farmhouse decisions, and the constant upward pressure of men telling their superiors what the man on the ground could see, that system defeated the most disciplined army in the world. Not because it was more disciplined, because it was more honest. Because the sergeant who knew the road flooded said so. Because the lieutenant who heard him changed the route. Because somewhere in the structure of a democratic society that had spent 168 years arguing about everything important, this was simply what you did. You saw a problem, and you said something, and you expected to be heard. The German army gave its soldiers orders. The American army gave its soldiers missions, explained why they mattered, and let them surprise everyone. The difference is what happens when the plan falls apart. In the German army, you wait for orders. In the American army, you are the orders. Fischer understood this by 1947 when he told the American intelligence officer that the Americans argued constantly at every level and won. Coleman understood it without knowing it, because it was how he had always lived. The sergeant arguing about the map near Aachen was not a failure of discipline. He was the point. He was the reason the war ended the way it did. He was what happens when a free people decides to fight.